The passion, the energy, the power, the spirit of hardcore.
All right, so I'm probably preaching to the choir here, I hope at least, but I find that a lot of us intuitively don't like KYC and AML or follow the money methods in general, but I wanted to give you a bit more perspective on why you should be that. This is not on? This one is on, okay. So yeah, this is just me about perspective on KYC. Let's get into it. So pay attention to the date, September the 10th, 2001. Donald Rumsfeld held a press conference where he basically admitted that the Pentagon could not account for $2.3 trillion in funds or in transactions, right? He didn't talk about terrorism per se. Instead, he said that the adversary is closer to home. It is the Pentagon bureaucracy. A year after, in 2002, Jim Minery traveled the United States trying to track down $300 million, and he could not find a single trace of it. So they know it was spent, they just don't know what it was spent on. In 2015, Catherine Austin Fitts, who is the Assistant Secretary for the Housing Department of Housing and Urban Development, found that between the Housing and Urban Development and the Pentagon, there was $6.5 trillion in what was called unsupported adjustments at the time. This was 54 times the amount of spend authorized by Congress. Right? This is just for 1 year. Now, Mark Skidmore, a professor at MSU, was like, well, that can't be right. Maybe she did a typo. Maybe it was $6.5 billion that was unaccounted for. So they got together and found that through the period of 1998 and 2015, there was 21 trillion undocumented adjustments, which averages around to $1.2 trillion per year for that period. Absolutely insane. Nobody knows where this money went. Now, this wasn't news to Franklin Spinney. He was a whistleblower that came out about Pentagon spending in 1983. And yeah, he's on the record saying the books are cooked routinely year after year. Fantastic. Now, you'd think that maybe that's got cleaned up after Rumsfeld's speech. Nope, it's still going on. Just recently, the Pentagon found $2 billion of accounting errors related to aid going towards Ukraine. And the total at the point of time this article was taken was $8.2 billion, right? So this is materials that have gone to Ukraine that had some kind of different amount associated with the items with it. Senator Chuck Grassley in 2024 had basically said, when it comes to catching fraud, the Department of Defense internal controls are a complete failure. We've known it for decades. This was in the context of COVID spending. In fact, Grassley has made an entire, not a career out of, but he's documented a lot of these things. He's found gas stations built in Afghanistan that were charged over $40 million when it should have cost $500,000. He's found forks and spoons that cost $57 each. There are hammers that were $400, pliers that are $1,000. And I think the more interesting one is toilet seats, right? The military the Pentagon has been charged $648 for Pentagon seats, and more recently the Air Force was charged $10,000 per toilet seat, right? I don't know if it was made of gold, but it should have been. Now, so where does this money come from? How is this even possible? How can their budget of $120 odd billion a year be more than 54 times in terms of their spend, right? Well, it comes down to one of the oldest still in operation programs that exist called MOCUS. It's written in COBOL, and it came out, I think it went live in 1958, if I recall correctly. So what this program does is kind of handle like all of the sort of contracting and tenders that the Pentagon puts out. But what it also does is, which is actually illegal for any government agency or program to do, is it tries to find old money, right? So if there's any government program that's out there that hasn't been touched in a while, it has like some funds left over in it, this thing sucks it out and gives it to the Pentagon, right? Completely illegal, but we're all fine with it, apparently. Now, let's put that in perspective, right? Because I've just been saying some numbers. Over here on the left-hand side is that $1.2 trillion that I mentioned on average that the Pentagon had been spending through that period. Adjusted for inflation, that's closer to $2.4 trillion. On the right-hand side, we have illicit financial flows, and we'll get into that in a moment. But the United Nations estimates that roughly 2 to 5% of global GDP is associated with illicit financial flows, right? That comes out to roughly $1.6 to $4 trillion. And NASDAQ's Global Financial Crime Report of 2023 puts their estimate of illicit financial flows being roughly $3.1 trillion, right? So on the right-hand side, the entire planet's illicit financial flows, one government agency.
Is that in comparison, or is the left part of that?
This is legal. Well, like this is not, this is a comparison. Yeah, this is not part of it, right? Like this is, if you could fix this on the, like, without having to like implement KYC or do anything, if you just improve the bureaucracy or you made the agency more efficient, you could solve for this $1.2 trillion, right? Like you could reduce that cost down, I don't know how much, but significantly, right? Because we don't know what that spend goes to. That's not the spend of the Pentagon that is approved. That is like the spend above the approved amount in which we have no idea where the money is going, right? It's insane. So, the day after Rumsfeld press conference, we had this, the 9/11, right? And this is basically the event that triggered our loss of civil liberties and surveillance of all kind, but in this context, financial surveillance. Within a month's time, the Financial Action Task Force implemented 8 of its 9 special recommendations, and the Patriot Act that was implemented to combat this kind of terrorism. Implemented these 4 sections, right? So one was giving the Secretary of Treasury authority. 326 is about the standards, right? So like what kind of information they take. There's the reason why you have to put your face up next to your identification and take a photo throughout the internet. 351 basically gives liability, immunity to liability for reporting on anybody. And then 352 is a mandate for financial institutions to implement the AML programs and the recommendations. This is the wrong slide. Okay, these are all slides, but it's okay. So the reason why the Patriot Act is important is because that reverberated throughout the entire planet, right? According to a LexisNexis survey in 2015, they were interviewing Asian banks, and here, even though local regulations were the reason, like the main reason why they implemented them, largely because of 352, US regulation embodied by the Patriot Act was cited being the main reason why they actually implemented these, right? So, yeah. All right. So, okay, fair enough. There's terrorists out there. We need to stop the baddies, right? Yeah, exactly. Do you see on there where the terrorist financing is? Yet? Do you see it? Or is that it? There we go. All right. $11.5 billion in terms of terrorism financing, according to our best estimates of last year from NASDAQ, right? It's a minuscule amount compared to the overall scheme of things, right? Just to put it into perspective, I'm not saying that this is not important. It's a sense of proportionality we need to think about, right? Now, that was in, the report came out 2024, and it was about last year. So, maybe we solved terrorism, right? Well, in 2001, the World Bank and IMF estimated that the total annual flow of funds towards terrorist organizations was between $300 million and $500 million. Like, not even $1 billion for all of the terrorists out there. However, in 2005, RAND estimated that Al-Qaeda had an annual budget of roughly $30 to $50 million. And in 2015, the Department of Treasury estimated that ISIS had roughly $1 billion annually. And in 2016, Europol reported that ISIS had an annual budget of around $2 billion, right? Now, to put that in perspective again, according to the Stimson Study Group on counterterrorism spending, between the 2002 and 2017, there was $2.8 trillion spent on combating terrorism, right? Or roughly $186 billion on average per year. This is roughly 16 times the amount of funding that goes towards terrorism funding. So, okay, fair enough. Now, we talked a little bit about the Pentagon unsupported adjustments. We talked a little bit about terrorism financing and put that in context. But we did have that whole side of illicit financial flows. So, what are they? Well, there isn't really a single agreed upon definition, right? But if you look at a whole bunch of them, you can start to infer what they're really about, right? So they generally comprise of tax evasion, multinational tax avoidance, theft of state assets, and laundering of proceeds of crime. Furthermore, they do cover market and regulatory abuses, and obviously some bad things like corruption, drug smuggling, and human trafficking. And I'm not saying that they aren't important, right? They are important. So Bjorn Lundberg got together with the top economists in the world, and they basically tried to dollar rank all of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and they did find, at least according to them, that tackling illicit financial flows is one of the top priorities. It's not the highest, but it is up there. In the Research Handbook of Money Laundering, they do outline the concern that basically if capital, all capital that ends up going towards criminals basically can be reinvested into more crime. So yeah, I mean, it's undesirable, sure. But at the core of the argument, outside of the humanitarian reasons, such as preventing human trafficking, the core of the argument really comes down to that if you view these illicit financial flows being outside of the system, then you can view them as lost GDP. Now, if they are lost GDP, then you can't tax it. And if you can't tax it, then it leads to a poor quality of governance, right? Basically, all IFFs are associated with ineffective state functioning, illegitimate use of state power, and they are an international concern because you might be able to, solve illicit financial flows within your own country, but if there's another country out there that is supporting them, then those capital can flow over there pretty easily. So it is a global problem. So what exactly are illicit financial flows? Well, like definitions, that also kind of depends. There isn't really a consensus on methodology. And depending on where you look, you can get very, very different sort of understanding of what that is. So here is 3 methodologies. Raymond Baker, and I'll talk about him in a bit, basically puts 30% towards criminal activities, 65% towards trade misinvoicing, and 5% towards corruption. Trade misinvoicing, by the way, is when it typically impacts developing countries the most. So you'll find like a multinational corporation will do some resource extraction, like mining ore in a developing country, but they will say that they only extracted a certain dollar amount, and it cost this much to extract, and then when they ship the resource elsewhere, they can basically, the value is much greater because they lied, essentially. Anyway, so Cardamone and Carr also found that trade misinvoicing was 80% and attributed 20% towards corruption. And the NASDAQ report that I've referenced a couple of times has a different sort of outlook where 12% goes towards human trafficking, 25% towards drug trafficking, and 63% towards other, right? Which is, everything else. So the funny thing is like at least like where all this sort of came onto the scene was Peter Reuter traced this back to Raymond Baker. He had a book come out called Capitalism's Achilles Heel in 2005. He also had a company which is called the Global Financial Integrity, which is basically where a lot of the methodology and the understanding comes from, right? He outlines that the state-of-the-art in IFFs is essentially prescience with no empirical basis for assessing the effectiveness of its proposed policies. And we know very little more about the issue today than we did back then. Now, if you look at the Financial Action Task Force official report, a methodology for assessing compliance with the Financial Action Task Force recommendations and effectiveness of AML CFT systems, it also lacks any hard data. Instead, it relies on the use of general crime statistics, anecdotal evidence, and subjective conclusions, right? And it's not really their fault entirely. By the nature of IFFs, they do rely on financial secrecy. So it is very hard to estimate, but at the same time, we have no, we're saying we recognize this problem, we can estimate generally how large it is, but we don't really know. And just to kind of back up what I've been saying, we have this report here saying that although different measures and models are used to estimate money laundering, no model to quantify money laundering is globally acceptable, right? There's a list of financial flows. We generally have an understanding of what they are and how what the composition is. But we also recognize that there's issues in tracking them. Are we effective actually doing anything with KYC and AML? The answer is, well, according to the Financial Action Task Force in 2023, less than 1% of global illicit financial flows is recovered, right? Ronald F. Paul says that anti-money laundering policy intervention has less than 0.1% impact on criminal finances. And the UN approximates roughly 0.2% illicit funds intercepted, right? So for all of the compliance that we do, it doesn't actually amount to basically any capture of criminal proceeds.
Jack shit.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Another way, so in other words, 99.9% of criminal proceeds are unaffected, right? I'll just let that sink in for a moment because I think it's pretty important. So another way to measure this is the direct cost to banks. Now, LexisNexis, in the report that I mentioned earlier, also looked at the cost of compliance and found that in the United States alone, and compliance for banks that was $26.4 billion annually for doing that, right? That's double the amount of terrorism financing for the entire planet. So that's just kind of, just to put things into perspective and proportion, right? Now, Ronald F. Paul goes on to say, compliance costs exceed recovered criminal funds more than 100 times over, and banks, taxpayers, and citizens like us are penalized more than the criminals. Now, at the OECD, they've also known this, I'm just going to read this out. The challenges for unintended consequences of financial regulation have been highlighted by business at OECD and the B20 for several years. Now, the crazy thing here is the cost-to-income ratio of traditional trade finance is roughly half, right? Or more than half charged to clients for trading. And a large percentage of that actually is because of these compliance costs. And now the reason that's important is because of this. This report is great. I think it originally came from the Copenhagen Consensus or Princeton. I can't remember which one. But when it comes to transaction costs, we should be trying to make that as efficient as possible and reduce them as much as possible. Because a 0.1% reduction in transaction costs allows a country to quadruple its wealth. This is the difference between Switzerland and Argentina. Just to pile on, Michael Levy says that no one could rationally think that AML controls in general or financial investigation in particular will solve organized crime. In his view, you would need to have much larger gains in transparency at the highest levels possible, right? So, yeah, privacy for the weak, transparency for the powerful. Now, when we talk about the high-level corruption here, right? Like, who is that? Who are we talking about when we're talking about these criminals? Well, to answer that, we can start looking at this report from Amnesty International, where they basically accused India, the Indian government, of abusing Financial Action Task Force requirements and recommendations to target civil society in the names of terrorism, right? But this wasn't towards terrorists per se, this is towards journalists, academics, human rights activists, and students. And they've been doing this since 2010. They're not the only ones. So the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, it's a think tank that's been in the UK for close to 100 years or so, very respectable, came out with this report. I highly recommend you read it. While they are largely targeting, or basically accusing authoritarian regimes, as we've seen, India, is debatable whether that's authoritarian. They basically document how these tactics are employed and why this happens, right? So here, like we see, they have reported that many of these authoritarian governments regularly employ intelligence fishing and scraping, strategic bank account freezing, harassment and prosecution of organizations, and politically motivated detention, as well as just general lawfare. Now, in many cases, it's, even though these authoritarian regimes would do this anyway, now they have legal cover, or at least a legitimized cover for it. But there's also instances where these governments actually employ it because of the requirements set forth by Financial Action Task Force, right? So if there's a certain date in which these need to be implemented into law, these recommendations, but they haven't done it, then they have to rush law through, right? And if they don't rush law through, then they'll be rated poorly and they get economically exiled as a nation. This leads to poor quality law being ratified and then subsequently abused. So Alex Cobham basically says that IFFs are likely, by and large, to be an elite problem, right? The main part of this quote here is if the incentives for abuse are actually likely to be the strongest at the top, of the income distribution, where the opportunities can also be concentrated, right? So like, look, you know, okay, some of us probably have done pretty well in crypto, but at the end of the day, like, we're just average citizens for the most part. If you're dealing with public funds or large amounts of money, you're probably much closer towards the political elite or financial elite, and therefore you are more likely to benefit from poor KYC or AML controls, even if you are the ones that are implementing it. So, you probably recall last year, Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Chase, accused crypto, basically saying it was a tool for criminals, drug traffickers, money laundering, and tax avoidance, and that if he was the government, he would shut it down. The irony is that just a few weeks after, he was fined JP Chase was fined $348 million. This was the first in a series of fines that led to 80 regulatory fines that went back to 2003, in which they had to pay a total of $39 billion. But JP Chase is not the only one, right? According to some files that were released from the Department of Treasury, the FinCEN files, we found that many major banks are participating in these kinds of shenanigans. And the amount of funds and the kinds of people that they are hosting makes the fines that are put towards them kind of laughable, right? So yeah. Furthermore, if you look at the Financial Secrecy Index, you'll see that the United States is #1 on that, and disproportionately so, right? So if you look at over here, there's like these little boxes. There's a box that says 25%. Switzerland being #2 is only just shy of 4%, right? The US is the largest. You know what? I won't make that. You can just look at it yourself. So, Peter Reuter goes on to say that asking a kleptocratic state to create an effective AML system is like asking the fox to create a better hen house. It is the governing political elite that benefit the most substantially from the weaknesses of the existing system of controls. These kleptocracies that we live in have real effects beyond just the money that we're talking about. Here is a report that came out from Bloomberg recently, showing that the trust in most US institutions is now waning, right? Whether it's from Congress to newspapers, the Supreme Court, to church, to medicine, the general public is losing faith in our governance. But this is not unique to the United States. This is also happening globally. The Office for National Statistics in 2022 found that 35% of the United Kingdom population said they trusted the national government. France reached a historic low where 82% of the citizens believe the country is heading in the wrong direction. And according to the OECD Trust in Government reports, the average public trust in governments hovers around just 41% and declining. So, according to Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, over 2/3 of countries score below 50 out of 100. They all have serious corruption problems. And it extends beyond just trust, right? These kleptocratic regimes are literally pilfering these systems that we depend upon. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the government debt will grow to a dangerous and unsustainable levels in the most advanced and emerging economies over the next 25 years. This was back in 2011, right? Now, since the 1800s, 52 countries saw a debt to GDP ratio of 130%. Out of those 52, 51 have defaulted. Now, today, the United States sits around 120%. By 2033, above 130%, and by 2050, beyond 150%. This is not sustainable. Now, like I said, this is also not unique to the United States. This is happening globally, right? The fiscal challenges confronting the United States are not unique. They are part of a broader trend that threatens the economic stability of many developed nations. The National Intelligence Council has projected that many governments in the developed world are likely to experience the same substantial economic difficulties. So, not looking great. And I guess that kind of brings me back to the Financial Action Task Force. It is an intergovernmental organization. It does not, its accountability is through its member states. It is housed in Paris in the OECD building, but it is not under the jurisdiction of France nor of the OECD, right? It basically has a form of sovereign immunity, which is derived from its member states. It doesn't have a legal personality. Like there's not like a business that, or like a non-profit or anything like this that's registered anywhere. It just exists. And like, you know, I'm hesitant to talk about like the member state responsibility because like, you know, it's easy to view governments as like a singleton, but like in reality, there's many different competing agencies and like it's a bit of a shit show regardless of where you look, just like in any organization. To me, there seems to be a distinct lack of accountability, right? Like it doesn't matter how the regulations are implemented because they're not directly tied to it, right? Yet, because of all the member states' involvement and their economies, they can influence other states to implement these things. That means that countries can be economically locked out, and as I said before, that can lead to poor law being put through that can then be abused. And there's absolutely no opt-out, right? There's no recourse. You can't do anything to really change this policy. Then going back to the Pentagon, right, or institutions in general, I love this quote from the World Bank, where there's wealth nations, right? Because in that report, they tried to figure out where the wealth of nations was. And it's not natural resource extraction, as you might think, right? Like pulling out minerals or oil or whatever. They found that human capital and the value of our institutions, as measured by the rule of law, constitute the largest share of wealth in virtually all countries, right? So if we improve our processes, or if we improve our institutions, we can actually generate more wealth. So for me, I would like to say that it is time for us to let go of KYC and AML. Follow the money methods are not effective. They're incredibly costly. We do not capture criminal proceeds. There was one slide that I did skip against because it was in the wrong order, but that was the only data from, let me find it. Sorry. All right. This is the only official data on illicit financial flows, and it's still in a pilot program by the United Nations, and it focuses on drug trafficking, right? I think the most noteworthy here is the $1.1 billion of inward financial flows for smuggling migrants from Mexico. Outside of that, like, I mean, it's not, like, it's an important problem, don't get me wrong, but like in the scheme of things, it's relatively small. So yeah, I think like it's time for a radical reframing of the problem. I don't have any solutions, I'm afraid. I don't think anyone does. But having that said, I think that if we focused on institutional efficiency by creating parallel institutions, because I don't think we can change through reform the existing institutions, we can create more wealth. And I think that, well, if you imagine a world like say 20 to 30 years from now, where our government's orders are based on blockchains, then we don't need to rely on things like follow the money methods like KYC and AML. We can create rules around public funds, right? What they can be spent on, what they can't be spent on. Certain bodies that use public funds that have racked up trillions of dollars would be accounted for. So I want you to keep that in mind when you're thinking about crypto and the technologies and try and build those institutions for a better world. Thank you.
Just having some AV issues. So yeah, I'll use this, and I think this is the microphone we'll have to use for audience questions. So that's all very gloomy. No magic answers here.
Gloomy is like I know I tend to frame things in more of a critical light or a negative light, but I actually think it's an opportunity, right? Like, yeah, I mean, like one way to view that is gloomy, but like the other way is, I'm holding a bit. I like to view that as an opportunity, right? Like, this is something we can actually improve upon, and this is how we can actually make a difference in the world by creating better institutions. You know, there's going to be a time where our generations are taking these leadership positions in these government institutions. There's going to be a time where there's internet native kids that are running countries, right? And so I think where I sit along that line is creating a shield, and I think where you sit is creating a shield for future generations from the previous ones. And if we can create that shield of institutions, such as cryptocurrencies, right? Or better voting systems, anything, then yeah, I just believe that it's going to create a better future. But like at the same time, we have to recognize the problems and not succumb to these narratives that are pushed on us. I think one of the earlier talks today was talking about like the illusion of choice, for example. This is one of those illusions. It's a nice idea that KYC is, you know, and we could solve for illicit financial flows, but the reality is that like we can't even solve the bureaucracy in like our own institutions, and if we can, then we literally like halve the problem in terms of government fraud, at least.
I mean, I was thinking perhaps as an analogy as well with the chat control, right? That both of these patterns are really fear-based. Is saying, well, bad things, you know, might happen in the world, but if we can monitor everything and track everything, then maybe it will be okay. So, I mean, you know, why, given the complete ineffectiveness of these approaches and you know, like the scale of those trillions of dollars worth of corrupt funds, why do you think there's such public apathy given the scale of this stuff and the ineffectiveness of these proposed solutions?
Yeah, I mean, like, well, chat control is just kind of the other arm of this, right? Like, you know, KYC is about financial surveillance, and, you know, something like chat control is just about communication or the right to associate surveillance. And they're both, yeah, like you're right, they're rooted in safety, like this notion of safety. And I mean, I have a bit of a hot take on that, I guess, like, or a controversial opinion, but I actually think that that's kind of a side effect of like a welfare state, and particularly one that's using representative democracy. Because like the incentives are in such a way that whoever the organized minority is, as I mentioned in one of my other talks, they're always going to appeal towards a majority of people and try and drive fear to extract resources from another group, right? And this just continually perpetuates and compounds on itself. And At the same time, as more people become dependent on these politicians, through welfare programs and so on, you create more passivity and more compliance. And there's multiple mechanisms in which that happens in our societies. I mean, like the way we complied and responded to COVID is a great example of that. I think that was a very good, whether we sit on the side of that, like the coordination around that, the propaganda that was out on that was just enormous, and the vast majority of us did comply, unfortunately. And I guess I'll to extend that answer a little bit longer, I actually, crypto is just a technology, right? All of this is just a technology, but it actually has much more to do with culture, right? And the wetware in our minds. And so one of the disillusionments I have with crypto at the moment is all of this degen culture. I mean, it's great, okay, whatever, it's not my thing personally, but if we want to have better societies, we need to have better cultures and better people, I guess. And the system isn't geared. I'm rambling now, but yeah.
Do we have a second functional microphone? Yes? No? Okay. I'll just open it to questions from the audience then, but I'll have to go back and forth annoyingly with this.
Okay. Sorry for my voice. Let me be sure that I understood you correctly. So KYC ML is established by IFFs. It's completely ineffective, as you just shown up with numbers. IFFs is untouchable because you can't do any legal actions against it. And if even a member state would unite against IFFs would just cancel it. And since this is an institution, you can't even do a freaking military operation against it. So I know you have said specifically that you don't offer any solutions, but what possible solution space could be? Can you give any ideas? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I do have. So firstly, the reason why I'm here, I've been in this space for a while, is because I do think blockchains or decentralized authorities, as represented by a blockchain and a consensus algorithm, does represent an order. The concept that I'm familiar with is what's been popularized by Balaji, is the network state idea. I don't really subscribe to that. This is an old idea from the 90s, which they were called cyberstates and virtual states at the time, right? But the reason why I find it interesting is not a pure exit strategy where you're trying to carve out some territory and move everybody there. That can be done, but it's very high friction, and really you're just perpetuating the same system. What I do like is even Czech here, right, had the parallel polis movement. In Hungary, you had civic circles. In India, you had the RSS movement, and these were civic organizational community development groups, right? They worked on local levels to establish political power in their case, but you could just see that applying to a parallel economy or a parallel government or a parallel society. And when I say government here, I don't mean a government in the way that we're used to them, but rather the implementation of a order in which consenting or voluntary agents, citizens, can come to their own agreements through. Now, the actual implementation of that is that's basically a whole other talk. But I think you maybe get the gist of where I'm going. I'm not sure if that's what you were hoping for in a solution, but yeah. I think I don't think we even have to. I think it's going to destroy itself, right? But yeah, exactly. Outgrow the nation state. Right. I think in Hedley Bull, who is a political theorist for international politics, has a book called The Anarcho-Society, right, which is about how nation states interact, right? But at the end of that book, he describes like a few different models for world order. And he's a proponent of this notion of like neo-medievalism. And it's kind of true, right? If you look at it today, because like you have like transnational policy networks like the World Economic Forum undermining national sovereignty. You have different nation states undermining national sovereignty and elections and so on. You have multinational corporations. So you have all these overlapping domains of sovereign claims, right? Which is kind of a problem if you have a Westphalian notion of sovereignty where like the Westphalian state controls its internal domains. So yeah, I think that we're moving into a neo-medievalist era in which the technologies that we build will be just another authority structure that overlaps everything and is non-jurisdictional, so it can span the entire planet or multiple planets if that happens. Yeah.
So we have, you have a question, Michael?
So my primary criticism of crypto and identity and governance and micronations and network states is that the only reason why our existing institutions are accepted by people is because they're enforced at the point of a gun. And we don't have, well, we have certain movements that want to have guns to enforce the law of crypto. But how do you see blockchain-based governance, institutions and systems being enforced without the point of a gun?
Well, firstly, I don't view it purely in that way. I think it's a little too kumbaya. I think that there will be like, you know, a Hoppian private production of defense, right? So like or even like Friedman's like machinery of freedom. So like you have insurance companies that end up establishing or, you know, basically managing their risk in which arises, you know, forms of enforcement, like physical enforcement. Having that said, like our technologies can allow for economic exile, right? And there can be degrees of that, right? And as long as you are like, as long as you're voluntary entering into those smart contracts, and you know whether you're collateralizing by stake or through an insurer stake or whatever, you can at least create a granular opting out if you misbehave within the confines of the system that you agreed to participate in. And I think that that does work to a certain extent, right? But the thing that I hesitate about that is it's not dissimilar to the kind of economic exile that like I've experienced, you know, just trying to do crypto transactions for the organization through a fiat bank, right? Like they've literally shut down the account for our organization multiple times. In fact, we're always looking for other bank accounts just in case to hedge that risk. So like economic exile is kind of like non-violent in one way, but it can also be extremely violent, right? And I don't have an answer around that. The other thing that I would like to add to that is like, you know, people tend to have like a Weberian notion of like a monopoly on violence when it comes to the notion of a state. But like if you look at ancient states, they didn't have the capacity to even influence like a monopoly on violence, right? And even in his original definition, he's actually talking about the authority on the application of violence, not a monopoly on it, right? It's a very different thing. Subtle, but it's different. That's just to add to that point, but yeah, it's a hard problem for sure.
Hi, Jared. That was an awesome talk. Thank you. I think it's a really important topic.
Thanks.
I'm a lawyer and I'm involved in sort of advocacy for better regulation, often around KYC ML in Europe.
Oh, cool.
And there was, you know, a big package. So just like 2001 in the US, the Patriot Act, when Russia attacked Ukraine, there were very rushed KYC ML sort of updates at the time. And crazy things happened at the time. That was 2 years ago now, I think. Almost, you know, self-custodial wallets were banned in Europe. That was almost the case. We had to sort of create a coalition against it, and we prevented it. But I have to say that having been involved in advocacy in the crypto space for almost a decade, we were always severely underfunded. So there was very little interest to fund something like that. I think more in Europe than the US. I think the US has Coin Center.
Yeah, I was about to say Coin Center, yeah.
Right, where you have like Jack Dorsey just gives whatever, $1 million, whatever. We just don't have a Jack Dorsey in Europe, right? Given everything you just said, do you think it's even meaningful to engage in conversation with regulators
Absolutely,
today?
absolutely. I mean, like, of course. You know, I'm skeptical of the outcomes personally, but I like, why not try? You know, like, I mean, if the channel is there, then like, yeah, we should be pushing for it, right?
So during this Pavel Durov stuff that recently happened, I called some people on Twitter out and was like, well, but if you believe the French story, then Pavel simply ignored letters from authorities that he should have answered because there are laws around speech and stuff in Europe. He ignored it, so of course they like put him in jail. And you know, why is nobody ever talking to regulators to ensure we have better laws, such around content moderation of platforms? And the people answered is, oh, well, we don't even want to engage with regulators. We don't believe it can ever lead to a positive outcome. So I think that's like a systemic reason why we as a community or a space don't seriously do the policy game well.
Absolutely, 100%.
Unlike the Googles and Amazons, the Facebooks who have done it in the, you know, why don't we do that? Why, would you say we shouldn't? That's
I definitely wouldn't say we shouldn't. In fact, I would say that's a sign of immaturity of the industry as a whole, that we're not, right? Like, at the end of the day, you have to play those games. I can understand the sentiment of like, why not wanting to do that? Like, I think at Proof of Work Summit, there was this discussion around the blockchain emissions as a result of MICA and the ESG scores, right? And like one of the messengers for the regulators there was like, why doesn't anyone want to give me the data? Like, it's, you know, and it's because, well, you're going to use that data against them. So like, why, you know, there's kind of mismatch incentives or like communication, miscommunication, right? From both sides. But like, yeah, we absolutely should be trying to advocate for a perspective. Having that said, you know, lawfare is a reality as well, and so there's only so far you can really push something. I think like Julian Assange is a great example of this, right? Like, he was a political prisoner for how many decades? And yeah, and the only way he got out was to basically lie, right? So it's, yeah, the law isn't code, but people are involved and they have power, so we have to work with them, absolutely. I mean, if it's a funding problem as well, then like we should probably discuss that and find a way to, yeah.
Maybe as a follow-up to the previous question, there's this MiCA regulation. I actually read it, and one of the things that I don't know, I was just shocked to read in there, but the BIS and the IMF are explicit, and other such institutions are explicitly excluded from that law. Yeah, just a comment. I'm wondering if you can comment on that. Like, why do you make regulation and these two institutes are sort of excluded from it? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and you know, I don't know, but it's a good point. It's a really good point. Yeah.
Well, it's the same pattern as everything else, right? One law for us and one for the others.
Yeah. Rules for thee, not for me.
So usually in order to make a change, the most effective way is not to organize such certain movement or something, but rather gradually raise the cost of oppression. And my question would be, is there anything we can do right now in order to raise the marginal cost of oppression with regard to AML/KYC/WTF?
Yeah, I mean, I no, yeah. It would be a whole other talk. But I mean, like, I guess, without indirectly, I think that's kind of why I find privacy technologies so fascinating, because they do raise that cost of oppression, as you say. At least as a technology, they can be applied for that use case. And that's something that we can do, right? Like, that is something that's relatively cheap to do, right? And permissionless to do. And yeah, I mean, I work on those technologies and I'm trying to advance them as much as possible within my lifespan. But I don't know if it's, I guess it is gradual because it does take time, but like the window's also closing as well. So it's a bit of a time pressure there, yeah.
Did you see the leaked Chainalysis presentation to the IRS that came out a week or so ago?
No, I haven't.
Okay, that's an interesting one to look for. I mean, I was just wondering more generally, have you got thoughts on blockchain analysis and how that fits into the whole AML picture?
There was a great talk last HCPP on exactly this topic. And the issue kind of comes down to like methodology, right? And then like you're basically trusting a third party's opinion on how they've done the chain analysis, right? And so that's at least how this is a year ago and I was half paying attention. So like that's my understanding of the problem, right? Is like you can't really treat that as like evidence or fact within an argument within the court, right? But it does. So yeah, I don't know. It all comes down to narratives at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I mean these are proprietary heuristics, which are a trade secret.
Right. But yeah, and then like if you're going to actually use it in court, then like the entire process should be completely open and inspectable by everyone who's every stakeholder in that dispute.
Hello, sir. Fantastic talk as always.
Oh, thank you.
I want to ask you to put on your prognostication hat for a second here, because you are very wise about these things. All right. So, granted, there's an attempt with communication and with financial surveillance to essentially control the rest of us by a small group of people at the top. But as you eloquently put, it's bound to fail. You know, that the system, even what they're doing, even the exponential amounts of money that they're spending essentially to control us, there will be massive default, and it's coming soon. And so what do you think then the end goal is? I mean, there's obviously thoughts of, oh, they'll just switch us to a CBDC currency and they'll switch out national currencies for a global controllable currency. But how do you see that process of, fourth turning happening? They create a crisis, and then is it to like just basically tell us, message, this is your new currency, it's based on a new form of debt? Or how does that transition from unsustainability now to what will end up being happen? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. Look, I mean, like if I was running like one of these regimes, if I was a nation state and I had a central bank, CBDC is a fantastic option, right? Because like it re-centralizes like a decentralized banking system under one ledger, and then you can control capital flows for the entire economy, right? Or freeze it entirely. That allows you to have an unprecedented amount of control and have a managed economy. But I mean, ultimately, it would probably, historically speaking, when things get managed that much, it tends to fall over pretty hard. The other sort of side effect is it creates like externalities, right? Like every time you set up like some kind of regulation or whatever, it'll create externalities, right? I was gonna go into like this whole thing about informal economies, right? Like a lot of informal economies actually arise because of these kinds of regulations, state interventions. Like there's a bunch of people that get locked out of the white economy, so to speak, and have to fall back to a shadow economy. So like, I mean, that seems like the most logical like path forward. I'm mostly concerned about just like, it's I view like something like the US government or any other nation state almost like a desperate tiger and that's cornered, right? And like saying these kinds of things is antagonistic and will probably cause it to thrash and lash out, right? What comes after, I don't know. Maybe, whatever the other system would be is where capital will flow, right? And I would like to think that would be cryptocurrencies. But I don't know.
Okay, I think we're out of time here.
Cool. Well, thank you very much.
So thank you, Jared.